She's an internationally well-known scholar, and we were very pleased that she accepted our invitation because her track record in the field of productive aging and productive engagement in later life, as she likes to put it, via programs, policies to involve older adults in paid and unpaid work, such as, for instance, volunteering, caregiving, paid work, is something which we have been following for many years. So I cannot list here to all her awards and past as well as still ongoing academic achievements, but you will be able to find them listed in the conference website. So her lecture, which is focused on ageism in the productive aging framework, will be discussed by Professor Guido Giorelli, who made it to be here with us today, of the Magna Grecia University in Catanzaro, Italy. I will present him in more detail later. Now, hoping that the connection is now working and I see her there. She was on my back, so I couldn't see it from the very beginning. Professor Morrow-Howell, I welcome you again, thanking you for accepting our invitation again. I give you the floor.
Thank you very much. I'm very delighted to be here. I'm working to get my PowerPoint up, and I want you all to let me know if that's working. Is that good?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, and you can see my PowerPoint? Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I feel like there's a delay between you and me, but we are far apart. Thank you very much for having me. Next time I want to be there in person as well. I am privileged to have this opportunity, which we rarely get because I am just working on some of these ideas that I'm going to present. The first part of my talk is very much on material that I've been dealing with for many years, sort of the background on the productive aging paradigm. But I've come more aware of the limitations of that framework. So really working on thinking about ageism and how it affects our whole thinking about productive aging. This is new thinking for me and my colleagues. I think this is the first time I'm formally articulating it. So I really look forward to the discussion that we're going to have afterwards. This is where the productive aging paradigm started, with the recognition and the calling out of the current narrative about old age. Age is decline, age is deficit. Currently, a very active negative narrative stereotypes about aging in older adults. At the individual level, these are the words that my students conjure up when I ask them, what does it mean to be old? At the population level, this is the silver tsunami dialogue that we all engage in to call attention to the importance of this work. Oh, but this is, older people killing younger people, the silver tsunami. So it was many years ago, 1985, where Dr. Robert Butler, who was the first head of our National Institute on Aging, introduced the paradigm of productive aging. He introduced that term. He had also introduced the term ageism several years before. He wrote the book in 1985 about productive aging, where he said, we need to turn away from the constant narrative of older adults as burden, older adults as a drain, and we need to focus our attention on contribution. He didn't say we needed to not know that there's the other side of this story about drain and about need, but that there's also contribution. We need to see older people as resource for family and community. human beings that are aging and bringing a lot of human and social capital. So that was the type of talk that Bob Butler did as he offered this new frame, this new perspective on aging. About 5-6 years ago, I got involved with the Gerontological Society of America's Reframing Aging Initiative. I am a master trainer for that initiative, and I'm on the advisory committee, and it has just seeped into me over time. And I'm sure that's part of my evolution in my thinking about the productive aging work. Because in the Reframing Aging materials, we talk about telling the full and accurate story of aging. That yes, there are declines, and yes, there's need for assistance, but there's also growth, there's also development. Reframing Aging highlights the potential and contribution of older people and calls for us to develop programs and policies to support engagement. Totally what we were thinking about in productive engagement. So the synergy between these two movements have come together in me and my colleagues' work, because the synergy is about telling the full story of aging. That age as asset is another truth alongside age as decline. So here's sort of the rationale that the capacity of the older population is increasing, that this capacity can be part of the solutions to all the challenges of our society, not just population aging. And as Mark Friedman, one of our luminaries, has said, that population aging is our only growing natural resource. So that's sort of the background of how we got there. But this group started to develop scholarship. It was an advocacy, it has been an advocacy agenda. People started working on the scholarship, and that's where my colleagues and I came in. Of course, any scholarship depends on definition. Here's our definition to narrow our research focus on productive engagement. We talk about these 3 activities that produce goods and services, whether paid or not paid. We've tried to keep the focus on those, but it has been controversial. The term productive is controversial in and of itself. And colleagues have looked for ways to replace it, but it's sort of got its own thing now. So we've never abandoned it, but tried to make sure that we're very aware of the controversy. Part of the controversy has been that activity, these aren't the only activities that we need to understand and promote. That activities, especially activities in later life around spirituality and connectivity, all wonderful. We're not saying those aren't important, but these, because of the economic contribution to society, are worth understanding and optimizing. So these are the outcomes that have been proposed over the years that we could achieve if we optimize the engagement of older adults in these roles. Individual, family, organizational, society. You can take a look at all of those. Clearly, engagement has positive benefits we've documented for older adults. For example, the easiest one, volunteering. Work, more mixed bag. A lot of positive outcomes, especially economic well-being, if work is achieved in the right environment. And finally, caregiving, the very important productive role of caregiving. How can we support it to optimize outcomes for the individual, because we know that we are getting outcomes for families, for community, and for society. It's been easier for us to document the individual outcomes because of our surveys. We talk to people. Much harder to document some of these other outcomes. But if we think about the outcomes to family, more engaged grandparents, transfer of income, happier relatives and family, and to organization, experienced workers, generational diversity in organizations, and for society, less reliance on public policy, less demand for long-term care. We have not documented very many of those. We speculate about them, but they sure are aspirational to what we could do if we optimize productive engagement. So what's not to like? What's not to like? Well, there's been a lot not to like. There's been major concerns expressed throughout the history of the development of this scholarship by some great thinkers Here's a couple. That productivity would be expected, that these roles would be expected on the backs of older people, and state and public sectors could back away from caregiving, from volunteering are great examples of that. And that we would judge people to the end of life by these market assessments. There's another list of things that have been brought forth criticizing extension of market logic, economic worth, highest value, individuals held responsible, and disadvantaged populations will continue to be marginalized if we expect work, volunteering, and more caregiving. Very important concerns. Need to take these seriously. These have become more front and center in my mind as my thinking has evolved. From the get-go, we said we need to articulate values so that we can avoid some of these pitfalls. These are values. They're important to articulate. They're the first step, but there's not enough. And we're still stuck on some of these points on maximizing inclusion in volunteer roles in the workforce, maximizing opportunity when age discrimination cuts people off, intergenerational reciprocity instead of conflict, creating choice rather than constraint. So just values that we have articulated. So in sum, this is the productive aging argument, that the growing human capital can be better utilized. It's our outdated programs and structures and attitudes that prevents disengagement. We need to reshape social expectations, policies, programs, everything to capture the potential. And we need to do it in a way that optimizes outcomes for the older person, not just for families and society. And inclusion of less resource older adults is critical. So that's been the argument. We've put forth a lot of conceptual frames. There's probably 7 or 8 in the literature that all are a little bit different, but the primary idea is always that individual capacity is growing with our longevity revolution, but institutional capacity is lagging behind. We don't have the programs, policies, attitudes, expectations to engage that. And all of the frames are getting more macro and macro over time to understand the physical, the economic, policy environments that influence this engagement, including the widest socio-cultural context. So with those conceptual frames, we have developed a lot of empirical work. Not going to go over it, list the things where we have made good progress on describing levels of engagement by different age groups and intersecting identities, the patterns. These don't operate in silos. We engage in multiple activities at one time, predicting micro, meso, macro level, who does the engagement, the outcome of the engagement, mediator, moderators. And finally, it's not just being a volunteer, it's not just working. We need to understand the attributes of those specific roles for individuals. So that knowledge is growing, and they have led us to a traditional call to action. And that call to action has been about maximizing engagement through policy and program. And we want to call to action for those policies and programs to pay attention to outcomes for older adults, families, community, and society. And we need more knowledge to guide these developments. We always are calling. Oh, one last thought on that. We have said, we believe that the productive aging paradigm sort of differentiates itself from a successful aging paradigm because the focus is on extra individual structures that engage that individual, not so much on changing individual behaviors, actions, attitudes, etc. More focus on policy and program. And we have a lot of policies and programs out there. Some we've actualized, some are being implemented, some are only on paper in the area of employment. These are 2 that are legislative acts to take protection of older workers further. In the area of community engagement and volunteering, in the area of caregiving. Again, some of these things are in process or passed and some are not. So the point is, the traditional call for action has been around these programs. Then, as one is in our opening points a couple of minutes ago, the pandemic came and sort of changed a lot of things, including myself, my colleagues, all of us in the work that we're doing. We don't need to tell you that ageism was already there, but the pandemic certainly made it all visible to us. It surfaced. It certainly raised my awareness about the profound effects on ageism on all aspects of life, including productive roles. So for me, being involved with reframing aging coincided well with this pandemic that highlighted ageism, and my colleagues and I began to call for a recommitment to productive aging work because we felt like the pandemic set us back with older adults in the workforce, in volunteer roles, and what happened in the world of caregiving. So that is sort of where we have been. And we're going to get into now how I now and my colleagues are trying to articulate ageism in this framework. Reframing aging has taught me and all of us, we should always start with saying, what do we mean by ageism? This audience doesn't need it, but it's been programmed into me now. But I like this because of the World Health Organization, as I know you know this definition. But how do we think about what actions, what feelings, and what thinking affect older people in our productive aging paradigm? So here's the frame for our current thinking. Ageism is pervasive and harmful. Ageism is a major barrier to advancing long and productive lives. Ageism, we can identify it and we can confront it, but it has not been fully incorporated into our conceptual models, specifically incorporated into our research agendas and our policy analysis. It's been in the background. It's been a discussion point. It's been an introduction point, but it hasn't been explicitly articulated in our models, research agendas, and policy analysis. That's not true for employment. If there's been any work on the effect of ageism, it's been on employment, and there's a lot. There's not much on volunteerism. There's not much on caregiving about how ageism affects that scenario. I think we'd like to bring some new ideas about explicating ageism by looking at a revised conceptual framework, by incorporating new theoretical concepts, and by asking some different questions. And that's what I want to share with you today. And this is some of the newer thinking that my colleagues and I have been doing. And so I look forward to your observations. Here is the new conceptual frame that we are looking to introduce. We suggest that ageism constructs can be infused as determinants of productive engagement at the interpersonal, intrapersonal, interpersonal, organizational, institutional, cultural, every level. We could articulate ageism as a construct. So we offer this heuristically. We give examples of that for the different concepts. We don't include all the previous concepts that have been in these boxes because we're trying to highlight factors that we think need to be added. So I'm going to walk through this. How's my time? I'm doing okay. At the legal and social policy level, we recognize that the existence of national and state laws and regulations do not prevent age discrimination. We have to interrogate the extent to which these laws actually protect older people. So the Age Discrimination and Employment Act here sent strong institutional cultural messages about the importance of not discriminating against people in the workplace based on age, but the effects of that policy, we've seen its limitations. There's research that says 60% of people report age discrimination in the workforce. So 60% of older workers report discrimination in a survey, but only 3% report it or have made formal complaints. And we know that current legislation has made it harder to demonstrate age discrimination in any legal kind of ways in this country. Further, state laws vary in this country regarding employment, and in a couple of states, employers cannot legally request dates of birth, dates of graduation, anything that is an indicator of chronological age. We do not know the effects of those kind of laws on the employment sector of people of any age. So the question is, to what extent does productive engagement vary in response to federal and state legal protections, and how effective are these policies? In regards to volunteerism, we have a national program here that has traditionally been called Senior Corps. It's targeting older people 50 and older into service roles and facilitating some engagement and subsidized participation in those roles. This organization has gone through a facelift recently, and it's been called a new name. It's now AmeriCorps Senior, and it markets much more visibly to a much more diverse older population, and it articulates the benefit of engagement. So this is a step forward for this national organization, yet fundamentally our programs remain age segregated. We have programs for younger people and programs for older people, and we are asking, on what basis are we developing our civic engagements, policies, and programs on age alone? Why isn't there a national service organization focused on engagement across the lifespan with intentional intergenerational programming? We can also talk about caregiving in that box. I cut that out of here today for the interest of time, but if we want to come back to how fundamentally we've identified some ways that age bias exists in our support for caregivers in this country. But we want to go on to the community level. The age composition of a geographic area not only affects the demands and supply of productive activities for people of all ages, it affects attitudes and expectations about resource allocation and intergenerational relationships. There's evidence that the level of ageism in a society is related to the percent of older persons and the availability of economic resources, with more older people and fewer resources leading to negative ageist attitudes and behavior. So just the extent to which a composition, an age distribution of a community affects the roles that older people engage in. And of course, community design, shared spaces can facilitate age friendliness, but they also can affect age segregation. And ageism has been viewed as both a cause and effect of age segregated. So how age integrated are our community designs and shared spaces? At the organizational level, our DE&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts most generally include age. There's starting to be some movement in that direction in this country, but in a report that's several years old now, only 8% of organizations included age as a dimension of diversity. We've been looking at universities and the extent to which age is included, and we're not finding much programming around ages and identity in organizational practices. So we're wanting to suggest that while age discrimination policies relate to hiring and promotion practices, that we haven't paid enough attention to attitudes and behaviors of supervisors and coworkers and colleagues who implement these policies and practices, and how these affect the experiences of older workers and volunteers. In this new diagram for us, we've moved personal determinants over to the right to indicate that these organizational and community domains affect the way older people and their families think about productive engagement, taking on productive roles. Given the documented effects of internalized ageism on attitudes and behavior, it's plausible that self-directed ageism affects motivation and confidence to engage in productive roles. We include family dynamics because we know that families have expectations and attitudes toward older relatives that affect role engagement. Social cueing from family and friends about retirement, volunteering, educational pursuits, caregiving decisions are very important to who enters what role and what experience they have. Ageist stereotypes held by family members may undermine the quality of caregiving between adult children and parenting. And we've had examples such as limiting living independently or access to driving or engaging in other minimal activities. We've relabeled demographic characteristics to intersecting identities just to emphasize age interacting with other identities that affect productive engagement and outcomes. We know that centering ageism at the exclusion of other isms limits the knowledge base to inform programs and policies. We put all of these in a social cultural context up in the right-hand corner there. The deeply embedded vision of the segmented life course sequences the development and use of human capital. Our education, work, retirement model is perhaps the oldest model of productive engagement. This model is one of the clearest forms of cultural ageism. Age is the primary criterion for access to education, work, and retirement. We are all influenced by appropriate age expectations due to this dominant model, and any deviation from these paths often result in barriers and risks. These age-based norms are supported by our cultural narrative about aging as decline and irrelevancy, and later life is viewed as a time of leisure or stepping down due to limited capacity. We have kept the outcomes, the intermediate outcomes. We're still focusing on employment, volunteering, caregiving, pursuing education and training. We suggest these outcomes could be expanded. The outcomes to individuals, families, and society could be expanded, because if we can alleviate internal ageism, the internal self-ageist ideas that older adults have, it might lead to more productive engagement, but also other health outcomes, as the literature on internalized ageism has documented, and that family outcomes could be expanded to include more realistic and healthier relationships around these role engagements. And finally, at the societal level, it would be movement towards achieving an age-just society. So that's our model. And we've also known that within these larger frameworks, like these, scholars have used theories of aging, of theories from all different disciplines, actually: role theory, socio-emotional selectivity theory, social exchange theory, etc. We use theories to propose relationships and explain outcomes. And we think with our new interest in how ageism is affecting this, that we need to infuse some new theories. We've proposed 2 in this first round of thinking that might be useful. I want to share some main points about these theories that we could infuse with you today. Critical race theory asserts that racism is pervasive and exists independently of individual people, and that racism is ingrained within ordinary practices. These same ideas can be applied to ageism. There's some specific concept, resource hoarding, which suggests that minoritized populations are minoritized so that there is less access to education, good-paying jobs, other opportunities. Resource hoarding. Interest convergence from critical race theory just nails one of our long-term concerns about the productive aging paradigm, and that is interest conversion occurs when power holders are interested in advancing social justice if it benefits them. So from this perspective, organizations strive to include older people when it's beneficial, when employers need employees, when agencies need volunteers, when society needs caregivers. The interest conversion concept captures our longstanding concerns in the productive aging literature that older adults will be exploited only when we need this paid and unpaid work. Of course, intersectionality has deep roots in critical race theory. It's an important concept in our work as well, older age adding to the accumulating identities that put people at risk. So critical race theory has a lot to offer us if we start thinking about it in regards to ageism. Another theory that came to the surface for us, minority stress theory, that seeks to explain disparity in health outcomes of minoritized population. It suggests that chronic stress from actual and anticipated discrimination undermines various dimensions of health. Most of this work is focused on racial, sexual, gender minorities, given their positions in society, but older people can be viewed as a minority living with stress from this marginalized position. External, real, observable stress, expectation, and the vigilance required in the potential face of that stress, and then the internalization of negative stereotypes have been proposed as part of this theory, and all of them of these stressors apply to older people generally, but especially those in volunteer and work organizations. So how do these stresses operate to constrain or facilitate choice to engage in productive roles? And how does it shape the experience of those roles? Finally, the concept of concealment. In minority stress theory, concealment is hiding one's identity to pass, and it has been viewed as a proximal stressor, maybe a coping strategy that ultimately produces stress. So concealment applies directly to the aging experience. Some older adults hide their age to get hired, to be considered for promotion, to gain respect, to feel better about themselves. There's a huge industry that encourages this concealment. How might we articulate the unique stressors associated with age as an identity, thinking about these concepts from minority stress theory, because I think it would be very fruitful. The last step will be thinking about research questions that now can come out of some of this new paradigm. And I list these for you here. I don't think I particularly need to read them, but I'm going to find my notes and see if there's anything interesting to say about them. I think on that first one, we've done plenty of race times other identities in our regression model, the interaction effect. It seems too superficial. It's at the individual level. We need to go deeper and think about how these structures, structural ageism interacts with other structural racism to constrain opportunities for engagement in later life. The question about how can employers be legally compliant and continue to be ageist in all phases of the employment process? How can we incorporate identity into the diversity, equity, and inclusion thinking that's going on and developing now? How can we introduce it as an identity factor that merits more attention than it gets, and that is future discrimination against all of the efforts that we make in terms of inclusion and equity around all kinds of minoritized group who are all going to face age discrimination if they live long enough? Again, something that is way beyond productive engagement, but how do we intervene across the life course? When, at what points are interventions towards externalized and internalized ageism the most effective in producing more positive outcomes in later life? Boy, that's a hard one. And finally, I think one of the most important ones is to figure out how individuals' beliefs about aging, how I think about my own aging, how family expectations and society affect our decision and our experiences and our outcome is something that we could get at with some well-designed research projects. All of these important, all of these are challenging, and I hope we can undertake some of these research agendas. My final thoughts is policy and programs, we focused on that in productive aging. It's very important to structural ageism, but I've learned it's not enough because individuals continue to act. So that we have to be concerned about structural ageism as well as interpersonal and intrapersonal ageism. That figuring out how to do this across the life course remains a big challenge, but affects all aspects of later life, including engagement. We cannot center ageism to the exclusion of other identities. It won't get us as far in the DE&I world. And finally, how to disrupt the cultural norm of education, work, retirement model. It still grips us. It's been loosened. People have talked about it for many years. We've blurred the boundaries, we've loosened the grip, but it still is so ingrained in how we move forward that I think we need to continue to think about that. So I look forward to hearing the discussion that's going to ensue and be excited to be part of this. Thank you. I'll stop sharing. Should I stop sharing? I think so.
Thank you very much, Professor Morrow-Howell, for your inspiring and stimulating reflection. And thank you also for soliciting questions from our side. Now, I hope we will have time for that. But before we come to questions from the audience or from anybody else, I'd like to give the floor to Professor Guido Giarelli, who in his role as discussant will probably add additional inputs and stimulating words. Now, just a few words to thank Professor Giarelli for having accepted our invitation to be here with us today. And this thank is also related to the fact that in his role of coordinator of different networks, is in a very good position to do so. He has been coordinating the research network on sociology and health and medicine of the European Sociological Association. And within Italy, the section of sociology of health and illness of the Italian Association of Sociology, and Italy's Inter-University Research Center on Active and Healthy Aging. So you can understand just for this glimpse of his roles that he's in a good position to give us very inspiring thoughts as well. So Professor Giarelli, I'd like to give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Giovanni. I'm very happy to be here. And thank you for the invitation, even to Professor Bronzini, to be called. I wish to congratulate with Nancy for this very interesting presentation. I completely agree, in particular, with what you said about ageism and strategies to counteract it. And you actually touched very many points, and obviously I cannot discuss all of them. But in particular, I would like to raise two main points I wish to discuss, even in order to try to answer to some of your final questions. The first one is a problem of definition, and the second one is a problem of approach. The problem of definition is regarding the definition of productive aging, which, as you know, is part of a series of approaches to aging aimed to eclipse previous disengagement theories and the idea of unavoidable senescence. It was a major turning point in gerontology since the 1960s, which started to consider aging no more the equivalent of illness and disability, but positively as an asset, as you said. Now, both successful and productive aging definition emerge in the US as the antithesis in some way of the disengagement theory, stressing the importance of physical and mental health in old age and of continuing activity and engagement. I particularly appreciated your effort to differentiate your productive aging approach from previous successful aging approach. However, as you know, the definition of both implied in some way an individualistic approach, which failed in some way to incorporate, at least originally, the fact that variations in people's lives and social structural position are interdependent, assuming that through individual choice and effort, people can age successfully. This is rooted in a neoliberal ideal of personal autonomy and responsibility, reinforcing attempts to limit state responsibility to provide the needed resources through welfare policies. You quoted a definition by some authors about this. Moreover, successful concept implies that there are winners and losers, because in the aging process, someone is successful, but someone else can be unsuccessful because maybe of disability or ill health, with the risk of this binary interpretation of successful aging becomes exclusionary and even discriminatory, contributing to the exclusion of the oldest old and of those most vulnerable and dependent. These are the reasons why in Europe we prefer to talk of active and healthy aging instead of productive or successful aging. Even European Union, as you know, adopted this definition for its funding programs, like Horizon. And this definition of active and healthy aging is based on WHO definition as a process of optimizing opportunity for health, participation, and security in order to enhance quality of life as people age. This definition is somehow quite different from the definition of productive and successful aging. Active here equals not to producing goods and services, but to continuing participation in social, cultural, spiritual, and civic affairs, and even economic ones if one desires, without any coercion. It is a more comprehensive and holistic approach, I believe, with which transcends a view of the possibilities of aging in purely economic terms, stressing especially social participation. The second point, as I said, regards the general approach. Now, both successful and productive aging risk in some way to fail to recognize the impact of structural impediments throughout the life course. In my opinion, the problem of the life course is in some way neglected. And neglecting this factor fails to recognize that a life course approach is a fundamental perspective to challenge any static notion of natural stages of life, emphasizing standard age-related roles and activities. The idea of a standardized life course has served for many decades to homogenize people into age-based categories, and old age has been just one of them, institutionalized through retirement and the introduction of age-based pension provision. Certainly, nowadays, we have probably to redefine life course and the boundary between work and retirement in order to destandardize it, but avoiding, I think, to emphasize in a neoliberal perspective, individual productivity and responsibility and success only. I think that we can be very healthy and active too without being productive at all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Giarelli. Now we do have some time for questions, but maybe before we give the floor to the audience, I'd like to check whether Professor Morrow-Howell herself would like to have a reaction to what she just heard.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Giarelli, for those comments. Very, very insightful and inspirational. I appreciate it. A couple of things that you made me think of. In the Reframing Aging Initiative, one of the fundamental frames that are trying to be promoted is that we cannot focus on individual choice, individual behavior, individual decisions across the life course as an explanation for late life outcomes. And in fact, that context matters, and that the public, at least in this country, still really comes from an individualistic approach about how people end up in life is a lot about choices they make. So we're really fighting that. And you know what? I've been seeing a lot. I've been out doing some reframing training, aging training in different locales, and people always push back against that individuals have much responsibility for this. So we have a long way to go there, but I couldn't agree with you more that it's about context, it's about structural impediments to achieving long and healthy lives. I love the World Health Organization model that includes participation. I tuck involvement in working, volunteering, and caregiving under participation as one form of participation. I couldn't agree with you more. There's a lot of other ways that participation is expressed and is important in all across the life course. And your comment, your sort of bottom line was active and healthy later life does not depend on being involved as a worker, as a volunteer, as a caregiver. Absolutely. But at the same time, we need to facilitate those roles for people who need to be in them and who want to be in them or who are in them one way or the other. So I don't want to deny what you say because I totally believe that you are right. I love the phrase that you use, the destandardization of the life course. That is a great way to describe what I think we are doing as we've solidified these on-ramps and off-ramps, to work, to education. How can we destandardize that and decouple it from chronological age as clearly as we have? So I appreciate your comments very much, and thank you for those reflections.
Thank you, Professor Morrow-Howell. Now I look at the audience just to check whether there are any questions. I see one hand, two hands, and now we have to check how it works with the micros. Thank you, Philip, for taking over. So first and then second here. Thank you. It doesn't work? I think you just have to speak out.
Thank you. Thank you very much for both of the talks. One point I just would like to raise, and when we were looking at this similar topics in the context of Czech Republic, we realized that we see a lot of what we call urban hegemony in the way we approach that many activities that we would usually see in rural contexts are just not considered, work, volunteering, or participation or productivity, but they still achieve similar things. So that's one point. And the other point that I would like to maybe challenge both of the speakers tonight, that what is your thought, or how do you approach the question, what's the opposition of ageism? Is it, not opposition is not the correct word, but is age celebration or, ageless society? Like which way we want to go, or what is the ideal on the other side of ageism? Thank you.
That's a good question. I defer to my colleague there for the first answer.
Are you, Nancy, suggesting that we should collect questions, or?
No. I was deferring to Guido for his answering.
Guido, would you like to start, or?
I'll be glad to go. I just wanted to hear what he had to say.
Yeah, Nancy, you can go ahead.
Okay.
If you...
Okay. Of course, the urban-rural continuum is an important part of this picture. Age composition of communities, opportunities available, ideas about what older adults are supposed to be doing. So very important. What's the opposite of ageism? What are we going for? That's a great question. Age inclusion, age justice. I don't think age neutral is the answer. That's why I want to hear what others think. An age inclusive society. We already are an age diverse society, but we haven't achieved age inclusion or age equity or age justice. What do others think about that?
Thank you, Nancy. And we can move now to the second question.
Thank you. That was a really fantastic presentation. My name's Natasha. I've traveled from New Zealand for this conference, so very excited to be here. I work for the Aged Care Commissioner of New Zealand, Carolyn Cooper. I've got a question about what your views are on recognizing ageism as a form of discrimination, because I've been at another conference recently where the UN independent expert on older persons talked about advocacy for a treaty, like another UN convention that recognizes ageism as a ground of discrimination. So I feel like there's a lot of advocacy efforts happening at the UN for a treaty and a convention, and I know some nonprofit organizations are supporting that. At the same time, what you mentioned in your presentation was quite a lot of national level, laws and policy changes. So do you think that it's worth going for another UN treaty, which is a lot of work and a lot of advocacy and energy and efforts? Or do you think we're sort of all better off looking at national and local level changes to address discrimination against older people in aging? Thanks.
Yeah, I agree that there needs to be something, and probably both, in everything that you've said. I do think I've encountered how people approach ageism differently than other isms in our society, at least here in this country. Ageism is not only invisible, we're always saying that it's invisible. People really don't recognize it as something that's ageist or ageism, and it's also dismissed. It's not as important as, and I would never argue about what ism is more important than another. That's a no-win situation. But when the work we've done, focus groups with diversity, equity, and inclusion staff at universities across the country, and I'm simplifying, but often their comments are, yes, we understand age is an identity and ageism is a thing, and age discrimination happens as this institution. And then it's usually a but we have so much on our plate with other isms, especially with racism and gender identity and sexual orientation issues on this campus. We can't afford to divert. We don't have enough resources or respect to divert. Another, or include, because we're not asking for diversion as much as to widen the radar to include age. The other interesting comment we've heard is there's not the social pressure, and here's where I might come into some more international work. There's not the social pressure to do anything about ageism. There isn't a Black Lives Matter movement in this country, a Me Too movement in this country around age. So there's no social pressure to deal with it until we elevate it as a concern. So I think we have to deal with it at all these different levels, but the campaign, as the World Health Organization has, and how ARP here has their campaigns to combat ageism, is a really promising step.
Thank you, Nancy. There is another question.
Yes, hi, my name is Francesca Di Giulia. I am a professor of sociology and a researcher. And I was just wondering if in your framework of research and both theoretical and analytical, you have also included all the ageism that affect the people who work with aging adults, from geriatricians in the field of medicine to direct care workers, home care, elder care assistants in other areas, and so on.
Yes. So the ageism, the age attitudes and expectations that exist both within providers and within recipients of care is something we're just becoming so much more willing, to try to look at and deal with. So geriatrician colleagues here will both express ways that they use age and that they feel like they participate in some age bias, and will tell, but more often speak of the ways that older people present that is very much internalized ageism. So we got a long ways to go in introducing ageism into trainings for everybody, and even to talking to older people themselves about how we have internalized ageism, because I am beginning to understand it now personally. And the stereotype embodiment theory suggests that, we hear these messages forever and ever and ever growing up. And then when we become older, they become self-relevant and they rear their heads up and affect what we think we can do and we can't do. And I and my colleagues are beginning to see that. So how that affects me as a patient, how that affects me as a service provider, such important questions. Thank you for bringing them up.
Thank you again. Okay, I do not see any more requests for questions. And so I'd like to thank again our speakers of tonight for sharing with us all your reflections, your critical views, and your inspiring words will resonate with us in the coming days. So thanks again, and a good evening to you.
Thank you all very much for having me. I really enjoyed this presentation. Thank you.
So now I'd like to invite you all to the welcome reception, which is going to take place going out of this plenary room on the right-hand side. It's in a corner of the patio of the university. So see you there in a few minutes. Thank you again for listening. And at 8 o'clock, the choir will also accompany our evening.